My name is Anthony O'Brien. I'm the copyright advisor here at the university. If you haven't checked out our previous webinars on copyright and licensing, please do so. So today we're looking at presentations and papers and posters, oh my. So basically copyright for conferences as part of the Researcher and HDR Student Workshop series. This is being recorded, but we'll talk about that in a sec. Before we go any further, I would like to do an acknowledgement of country because we feel that's very important here at the university. So our university acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands within our footprint areas. That's the Awabakal, Darkinjung, Biripi, Worimi, Wonnarua and Eora nations. We pay respects to the wisdom of elders past, present and emerging, and extend this acknowledgement and pay respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us live today or watching the recording. Okay. So before we go any further, again, I always like to do a little bit of housekeeping. So please mute your microphones. We will have opportunities to ask questions a little bit later. You can either post them in the chat or when we pause at different times, we'll ask you to put your microphones back on. As I mentioned, the session is being recorded, so it will go up into YouTube and I'll be sending that link out to all the registrants. So hello, if you're watching us from YouTube land. So as I mentioned, this is part of a series. We've done quite a few sessions in semester 1 and these are the semester 2 ones. So as I said, this one is about conference copyright. Just before Open Access Week, we're doing a special session on open data called Data Do, Not Data Don't. And the previous session, which was last week, our time, is up on YouTube already, Getting Copyright Right in Your Research. So we'll be sending out the link to the playlist with all of those webinars in it as well. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Nicole Gammy, who is a research liaison librarian. My other colleague, Jenny Schoolander, is also joining us in this session and she'll be presenting a bit later. So as I said, post any questions you have in the chat and we'll answer them as soon as we can. All right, Nicole.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Anthony. So we'd like to start off looking at, to answer our question that we posed to start with on the opening slide, is talking about copyright and considering how that varies between countries. As you may be aware, in recent years, we've had, there's been a lot of trade agreements signed. We've had one done with the US, there's also ones with Europe and other places. And interestingly enough, copyright falls under a lot of those trade agreements as well. So a lot of things have been aligned. So for many places, not everywhere, but for many places, it's often death plus 70 years. So things are in copyright for that period of time. Often that usually covers the US and Europe, but please make sure you do check because there is variation in that. The other thing that you need to think about and be aware of is what is allowed under legislation may change. So such as we've had some copyright reforms here in Australia and those things and those evolutions will continue to change. And also what's between jurisdictions. So for example, you often hear the term about fair use. That very much aligns with what happens in the US, not so much here in Australia. So being aware of all of the little bits and pieces and the quirks is really quite important. Where like in Australia, as I said, fair use doesn't apply. So basically what we need to do is either it needs to fit with an existing exemption so you can use it, or you need to get permission. Most things are probably going to fall into the latter category of getting permission to be able to reuse them, which isn't a problem. You just need to make sure you're a bit prepared because it can take a little time. The other thing that people need to think about too is where the work is published will impact the initial copyright in the work, but where the end user is based usually controls their reuse options. So what we mean by that is, for example, if it's say published here in Australia, all the relevant copyright applies here. But say, for example, if there's a researcher or someone in the US who wants to use it, they may be able to use it under the fair use dealings that are as part of the copyright in the US. So just being aware of some of that sort of stuff and also what you can do here in Australia if you're reusing items. So moving on to think about at an institutional level. So like a lot of things, each institution is, I guess, unique in its line. And so the various arrangements can vary between the institutions as to who owns the copyright. So for example, in UON, researchers own the scholarly outputs that they produce, but this may not be the same for all institutions. So if you've got collaborators who come from other institutions, make sure that they understand what institutional policies exist around IP and copyright so that there's no hassles a bit later on. Another thing too is that we need to consider is that copyright can be owned by multiple people. Where this is or can occur is where the work is inseparable. So for example, you might do a joint painting as an example, or it's so independent that you can't put sort of, you know, put a line through it or a knife or something else to kind of split the various components. So where that happens, it's really helpful to potentially get things in writing. And if, as copyright doesn't necessarily create a ranking, everyone is equal, it's also really helpful if someone is asked, or say if there's 2 or 3 people involved to equally own the copyright, if someone is asked to sign off on a reuse that requires permission, really important that there's communication between the various parties so everyone is aware of what's going on. Might solve a few hassles down the track and also might, I guess, maintain the collaboration for other opportunities in the future. So moving on to thinking about some of the online considerations, I guess COVID's had possibly a couple of advantages now. At least you can, if you get an international conference, there's a chance you might be able to go if it is presented online than having to find the money to fly and everything else. But if you're presenting at a conference and it is online, it does add a few complications. With all the shared content and that sort of thing, there's a really good chance that a lot of conferences will be hybrid, so you'll get that opportunity either to be there in person or go online. And there's a really good chance on top of that it will be recorded. So one thing that people need to think about is if you're signing up to present at a conference, what are you agreeing for them to be able to do with your materials? So what permissions are you giving them straight up by agreeing to present at their conference? It's not necessarily an issue from that side. It's just a case of being aware. In terms of a common outcome, it may be behind a login, so asking also to what's going to happen with the materials down the track, but the content may be shared. So the big thing, or one thing you might need to think about, and we see plenty of examples these days, you get onto Twitter and you see all sorts of things about events that are being run. People have taken happy snaps at webinars and other things around the track. You know, will your content end up on social media? So someone's been sitting in the audience and watched your presentation and go, oh, I like that stuff. So they take a happy snap and then post it on Twitter. Is the content that you're showing on your slides going to be a potential issue for that? Also with posters and that sort of thing, if someone gets a chance to walk around a venue or see something again online, will sharing that content be an issue? So Anthony's going to talk a little bit later about third-party material. And Jenny's also going to raise the challenge that a lot of people face about, you know, we haven't just got predatory journals anymore, we've also got predatory conferences. So a few little things to think about, nothing that's insurmountable, but just a case of being aware of some of the, I guess, the changing landscape with these new opportunities that we have been presented with due to COVID. So wandering along from that, talking about the ownership, more specifically the ownership of conference materials. Another thing to think about too is that as part of your process in selecting a conference, will the content be peer reviewed as well? So if you want that, then that might be something else you need to think about, and identifying who owns what. So when you're looking, when they present you with a copyright thing to sign, what are you signing over to the conference or to a publisher down the track? If you're not too sure, please, the first thing to do is check the contract, don't just sign it and send it back. And if you're not certain about what some of these clauses mean or what the implications and stuff are, ask about it. If you're asked to sign over in terms of a publisher where it's going to become a journal article, there's potentially some addendums. The Spark addendum might be one that you can consider using, and think about what other rights that you may want to keep. So for example, if you would like to use your content as part of your teaching materials, will signing this copyright over cause implications in terms of how you can use that, say in a teaching sense, if you're wearing both caps. Another thing to think about too is that if you get to this point and you've got an abstract or you got your slides for your presentation, please consider making a deposit to Nova. We love to add content to Nova to show what our academics are doing. So that's certainly something else that I'd like to encourage and see people do. The other thing too is if, for example, it's being retained, like if you're retaining a lot of your copyright, you might like to, you should think about what the conference requires, because they may have some copyright things as part of that. But if you're left to sort of, I guess, make a decision about what sort of copyright to put on that, consider what it is, and where possible, think about putting a Creative Commons license on it, which still allows you and requires people to attribute the content to you, but it gives you some sort of copyright protection in the long run for your content and your IP that you're putting out there. So that's the end of the first session. Are there any questions?
There's no questions in the chat at the moment.
Fabulous. Not so fabulous in terms of please do ask your questions, because no doubt someone else is thinking the same thing. So please, you're welcome to speak up. I'd like to hand over to Anthony, who's going to go on and talk about that third-party copyright material that I mentioned earlier.
Yes, thank you, Nicole. So for those that haven't come across the term before, third-party copyright basically just means material that's owned by somebody else. So even if you've created a paper or a poster or a journal article, you may, if you sign the copyright over to somebody else, it's no longer yours and it becomes third-party. And this is fairly standard practice when it comes to scholarly publishing. Unfortunately, some things are still kind of holdover from the old days when the only way to put something out was to go through one of the big publishers. So there is a lot of confusion about copyright and use in online spaces and use with conferences and journals and everything else. So if you are kind of traveling around on the interwebs, just make an assumption that everything is copyright unless you're told otherwise. There are some materials that are known as public domain, so they're out of copyright, and there are plenty of open license materials online. But if you don't see something that spells out explicitly, hey, this is out of copyright, or hey, this is openly licensed, assume that it's all rights reserved copyright. So that's where the owners get to basically keep all of their rights and they get to control what happens to it. So point number 2 there leads on from that one. So for reproduction and a lot of reuse, copyright owners get to control how that happens. So if you take that material and you reprint it, repurpose it for your own needs without a license or without that permission, you're basically risking getting caught for infringement. And this is something that people never really used to think about with conferences. In the old days, it was kind of locked to you showing a PowerPoint to a room of people face to face, and there was very little risk of that material escaping out into the world. Nowadays, so many conferences are online. As Nicole said, there's so many options for people to capture your material in some way using the device in their pocket and to post it. So this is where tying up those little bows on the copyright is so important, because you don't want to be the person that gets, accused of infringement. It's not a good look for your reputation. So yeah, always reach out, look for that license, get that permission from the owner, or if you're not sure, you can reach out to any of us that you can see in the video today, and we can provide support there too. So one of the big problems, and I mentioned that public domain aspect, that gets kind of bandied around, and people confuse the copyright public domain with the kind of generally used language of public domain, and they are very, very different things. So copyright, specifically public domain, means it's out of copyright. So either it's of an age or of a form where it's no longer in copyright or wasn't copyrightable to start with, and it's just free to use. I actually had a meeting with someone earlier where we were looking at things that were published from a book, and it was more than 70 years past the death of the author. So that book has now fallen out of copyright, and he was right to take those images and use them under the kind of public domain rule. But the other confusion that people have is like, oh, but it's online, it's public domain. It's not. Go back to point number 1. Most material online is copyright unless otherwise noted. So just because it's openly accessible doesn't actually mean that it's open licensed or out of copyright. So keep that in mind. You might have a favorite meme. again, just pulling from my own conference experience, lots of people put memes into their conference presentations. They can actually get you in trouble because in certain jurisdictions, memes are a very gray area. So they might kind of fall under reuse in the fair use, I should say, in the US, but here they're not so clear cut. So, don't put anything, third party wise into your PowerPoint that you can't get permission for or get some kind of open licensing around. Moving on, there are lots of types of licenses. It doesn't just have to be open. There are paid ones, there are lots of free ones. And working in that research space, I've learned that a lot of people are relying on paid images, for example. So have a look at your contracts around those things. We honestly can't, you'll probably hear that a few times during the various copyright and licensing sessions. Always look at your agreements, your contracts, your license. It's so important. So Creative Commons is another big one. And if you have a look at the copyright pages on the library website, you'll see there's a whole heap of open license materials, some Creative Commons, some otherwise, some under free licensing. So GPL is another open license that's usually applied to things like software. It's a general purpose license from GNU, and they're really great in that area. And of course, there's the old chestnut of going off and getting that direct permission from the actual copyright owner. A lot of people will go, okay, well, you're using this for a solely purpose. I don't mind if you reproduce that one image as long as you give me appropriate credit. And that's another key thing, that attribution that Nicole mentioned earlier. Providing that source credit is really key to being able to reuse a lot of third-party materials. And again, going back to that licensing permissions text, always have a look and make sure you pay attention to what you need to do to be able to reuse that material. Honestly, can't stress that enough, because if you don't follow the licensing information, you could actually be doing kind of unintentional infringement. So always have a look at that and double check what am I required to do to actually use this material properly. Speaking of using material, I'm going to do a little bit of a demo because I get a lot of questions around PowerPoints, and I thought, hey, conferences, perfect place to do a little demo of how actually we can get some free materials directly from Microsoft and also from some of the searches that are built into PowerPoint. So what I'm going to show you is specifically for Office 365. So if you haven't used that before, this is the online version. So lots of staff that work at the university get the kind of program versions. It doesn't work very well in this, so that's what I would suggest. Log on to Office 365, use the online version, because it's putting it up into the cloud, so you've got instant backup. B, it gives you so many more options and features than the program version does. And as the last point on the slide says here, if you've already created it, in the program, you can upload it into Office 365 very, very easily and start working on it there. And for that matter, you can also download it out of Office 365 and throw it on a USB as a backup. Probably can't stress that enough. If you are going in person to present, always have an offline backup copy of your PowerPoint or your presentation, if you're not using PowerPoint itself, just in case the internet happens to be down or something like that. Never a bad idea. So as you can see, there are lots of features in here that I'll just talk about very quickly. Microsoft provides a whole heap of icons. They provide some stock images, including some cutout people that I'll show you. There's a Bing image search, which goes off and searches Creative Commons licensed images. And they also have this really great designer function that allows you to kind of play around with how the slides look. So let's go and have a look at how that works. So here we have our Office 365 suite. We've gone into PowerPoint. So I'm in the insert menu here, and you can see there are lots of different shapes. So there's the one for icons, for example. Is it going to decide to open for me? There we go. And you can choose all these really great things. These I've already looked into these, by the way. These are all freely made available by Microsoft. So these are actually considered public domain by Microsoft, even though they've created them. So they've put them directly into the public domain themselves. And there's a whole heap of stuff that you get access to as part of the Office 365 subscription. So you can play around with that to your heart's content. But most people are interested in the pictures option. And a lot of people would be used to, I've downloaded an image from somewhere, I'm going to insert it from this device. And they've probably ignored some of these others that are here. So the stock images, again, these are things that are fully licensed from Microsoft, and there are some lovely, pretty things you can do, but you can also search for different things in particular to actually find something that works for you. But one of the things I was really pleased to find out about were these cutout people. So you can have your own backgrounds, and you see how they've got the gray and white squares on them. That basically means they have a transparent background. So we can put, say, there we go. We're talking about copyright. This person's a bit nonplussed. We'll just throw him in there. It automatically does alternative text for you. You can resize them, and they're really good quality. Let's see if I can throw a background or something on here quickly. I don't suppose we really need to worry. But you can see there, he's cut out, so there's no bleed through. If I made the background blue, he would be nice and, you know, still working there. Although obviously we'd want to probably try and find something that matches him with his green a little bit. I mentioned the designer element earlier. That's what this is down the side here. So you can see here, they've taken that same image and they're doing some different things with them. So it gives you a little bit more leeway to actually do some artistic things without actually having to be too artistic yourself. Basically, you can just go in and pick something that works for you. I'm not sure he was a good choice for this one, but you get the idea. So all of that's there. And it's a really easy way of kind of spicing up your slides a little bit. So I'm going to remove him. And if we go back to the insert menu again, so the Bing one actually goes off and searches online. So let's do, I get contacted by a lot of legal people, so I'm going to throw Parliament in there. And you can see here, if this stays ticked, it searches for Creative Commons. So I do recommend you keep this box ticked. It sorts out a lot of the issues. And you can basically go, okay, well, I like that one. I'm going to insert it. So what should happen, if it's working appropriately and Microsoft hasn't stuffed us over, is it will bring in an actual attribution for this. So anything that's Creative Commons licensed actually requires a little statement to say what it is, who made it, where you got it from, and what it's licensed under. So if you'd like to know more about Creative Commons, there's a webinar we have around doing that, and this one's saying it doesn't work. Okay, of course it doesn't work because I'm doing a live session. So let's try that again. The only thing I do find that I don't like about this is it doesn't remember you searching. You've got to redo it every single time. Let's go with this one. I'm sure this, there we go. So this one worked earlier, and look, it's actually doing it correctly. So we can resize this. And then for whatever reason, again, it doesn't quite work perfectly for the resizing, but you can see that the attribution comes through in a separate text box. This one isn't named, so it's just calling it this photo. There's no author, so it's just saying unknown author. But again, we can switch that out using designer. And as you can see here, it keeps the attribution. It hasn't quite got it on the slide properly though, I noticed. So let's just pull that one up and over a little bit. So anyway, I'm not going to fiddle too much because obviously I don't want to waste time doing that. But you can see there, we can do some quite nice looking slides with some officially licensed images that aren't going to get us in trouble copyright wise. So we've used this appropriately, we've reproduced it, we've got our statement of attribution, and we're good to go. So a very easy way of doing it. So the one thing I would suggest, if you do bring in an image and it doesn't come with that little text box, delete it and find another one. So for some reason, Microsoft doesn't bring them in on all of them. And just to reiterate, if we're not doing the attribution on these images, it means we're not using them properly to avoid infringement. And there have been some cases of some US creators actually suing people in court because they didn't do the attribution stuff on this. I think these people were particularly trolls looking to get some money, but it's just worthwhile always making sure if I'm bringing in something that's Creative Commons licensed, I always have that attribution on there. So just something to keep in mind. All of that is free in Microsoft, built in, ready to go. You just have to double check that you're using it appropriately. Do we have any questions? No, okay, I'll go back to presenting. And then I'll hand over to Jenny to look at some of the other considerations that you might like to think about.
Thanks, Anthony. I'll just bring my slide across. So what I'm going to talk about is just some of the other things that you want to be really conscious of when you're going to a conference. The first thing I want to touch on is Anthony showed you some of those wonderful PowerPoints, at what you can do with PowerPoint, but also the university has a whole lot of templates that you can be using, and you need to be thinking about how your presentation might be used in the future. So keeping things consistent, having a professional view of things, and making sure that you've got the correct templates that the university wants you to use is going to be important. So before you go to present a conference, check the requirements for the use and the inclusion of any of the university branding. And as I said, keep it consistent. It's important to have a really professional, consistent look. Where the branding is used, the university expects you to be using the templates. And we've put a link there to marketing and communications and their resource hub. And they've got all kinds of different things that you can be using in all sorts of different ways that will give you the branding for the university. Thanks, Anthony. So then the next thing I want to touch on is making sure you're promoting and posting everything online. It's important that you promote yourself and your research. That's the main aim of going to conferences and things. They're a wonderful opportunity. The other thing that you can do is use as much of the content that you have in the promotion itself. So social media mentions are a great way for you to be getting your research out there. And also there are tools available now that will capture any of those social media mentions. We've got a tool called Altmetrics Explorer. And so if your research is mentioned in social media, in a news post, something like The Conversation, I think it captures conferences as well, but if you've put links to your research in any of those things, they can be captured and people can be connecting with your research. Think about all of the different online opportunities that you've got to promote your research. Make sure you're adding a link to the conference, but confirm with the conference organisers first what you're able to add in the way of, where are you able to add that information? Can you add it to personal websites and social links such as ResearchGate, which is a commercial entity, or LinkedIn or Google Scholar? So be thinking of all the different ways that you're promoting the fact that you're going to this conference, but also making sure that you're checking with the conference organisers. The other place that you can be putting any of this information is in our repository Nova. It's a great choice because and any institution will have some kind of repository like Nova, and those repositories can be viewed by people external from the university. They'll generally be open access links as well, and having sort of information that's coming from the fact that people have viewed your Nova record is something that's usually quite okay with publishers. But you also need to be confirming any of the publishing requirements as far as, your limitations with the conference organisers. They go hand in hand. Is the publisher saying you can't advertise at the conference, or is the conference saying you can't be adding this to your publication? So you're always wanting to be checking what are the copyright implications of presenting at a conference. But at the end of the day, what you want to be doing is communicating and circulating your research in a broad range of ways, not just to scholars, but to the general public, because any institution that you'll be working for, particularly the university, they're wanting to know not just the impact of your research, but how it's being engaged with as well. Thanks, Anthony. I can just get this to move. So, funding agreements. So there are copyright considerations as well when your research is being funded by someone. So the funders themselves may have some kind of requirement around promoting your research. Also, you need to be checking, is there anything noted about mentioning the funding itself, the use of their logos or branding? So some of these things you'll need to check, and it'll be incorporated in some of the agreements. Check what you need to do and what you're allowed to do in an open access environment as well. Sometimes there's limitations about what you've got to do. Also, if you're presenting at a conference, what's the requirement from the conference? Do they expect you to provide open access, or is there a limit on open access that they're saying you can do? And do you want to publish in open access? So be thinking about open access all the way through the lead up to the conference and after the conference, and find out what the limitations and restrictions are. You've also got to be aware that licensing requirements and options can be reliant on whichever version of your work is being put forward. So there's a difference between the author manuscript, and that's usually the one that can go into our Nova repository, or then there's the fully published PDF version of something. So there's different copyright licensing requirements that are linked to each of those. So you need to be a bit clear about which version you're going to be putting up. And then also some parts of your conference presentation may have different funding and copyright requirements. So for example, papers going into a proceedings or into a journal are going to be different to a poster presentation. So again, it's being aware that there are going to be slight differences between any of these different things. Thanks, Anthony. So then something we wanted to touch on, because it's really important to be aware that not all conferences are created equal. We do know that conferences present a wonderful opportunity to be able to put your research forward, but you need to be mindful also of the return on investment of your time, the money, the expertise, and future research collaborations. So you're wanting to make sure that this conference is going to be the best place for you to be going to. So when you are thinking about submitting to a conference, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. So that first point that we've made, predatory conferences, and there's a bit of discussion as to whether they should be called predatory conferences, but for the sake of this webinar, we're going to call them predatory conferences. These are conferences that will target generally early career researchers or people that are almost ready to publish their PhD thesis, those sorts of things. So they know that you're wanting to build your reputation. So they're going to lure you, or they're going to ask you to contribute to their conference because they know you're wanting to build your reputation. But have a look at the conference itself. Is the conference covering a wide range of topics? And does it look like there are other conferences happening at the same venue at the same time? So that's a clear indication that this is possibly not a one research field area focused conference. How quickly are they accepting the papers after submission? There needs to be time for thorough peer review, even when you're submitting a paper to a conference. And if they're doing a very quick accept of paper and say, yes, you can present, you've got to question, has there been time for a thorough peer review process of your paper, or do they just seem to be approving the papers? As far as charging you for things, are you being charged to present? And are there charges for every single paper? So being charged a fee to present at a conference it's quite common, but also have a look and see how many times you're being charged to, you know, if you're presenting at 3 different sessions in that one conference, are you being charged for each presentation? Have a look at the conference history as well. You'll be able to have a look at the past conference, any past conferences, and see what the quality and the output was from any of those. Also, you can be looking up the actual organisers, the keynote speakers, any of the presenting bodies. Are they respected experts in your field of research? And when in doubt, you can actually contact the keynote speakers and confirm that they are actually being involved. So the other thing is look at the structure of the conference program. Does it look like it is going to be an academic program focused in one field of research, one area of research? Or, you know, are you having 3 hours of conference on one day, and on the second day you're all going on a bus trip to Mallorca, and then on the third day you might be having lunch or something? So an academic conference will have a really nicely structured program, and there won't be a lot of sightseeing and lunches at the local hotel. Finally, does the invitation look and feel like a sales pitch? That's a great indicator of whether or not this is a conference that you might want to avoid. Is it looking too good to be true? Because as we know, if it looks too good to be true, it probably isn't true. Now, we've also mentioned on this slide that there's a couple of places that you can go to actually look at a checklist of what makes a good conference, as opposed to what are the signs that you should be looking for. And the Think, Check, Attend is a site that you can go to have a look and do a bit of a checklist. And also that predatory conferences, what are the signs? That's a journal article that pulls out a lot of the things that I've talked about today. So that's, and Anthony's got that up for you, and the site. So that's sort of going through some of the things that you really want to be aware of, and make sure that you're doing all you can, again, to make sure you're getting the best value out of this. As I said, conferences are a wonderful place to be able to promote your research. So you want to be making sure that you're attending good quality conferences. Are there any questions? No. So I'll hand back to Anthony.
Great. So we will be sending out the links, the key links from this session as part of the email with the recording. So yes, can't stress this enough. If you do have questions around, you know, open licensing, you know, your conference contracts, all that kind of stuff, you can reach out to copyright support. Oh, of course, third-party materials that you're planning on using. So we've got an online form there at newcastle.edu.au/copyright-request. So copyright-requests. If you go to just /copyright, that ends up at the university's copyright page. So don't go to that one. So copyright-request. There's also some online materials that are being added to copyright-support. So we have a lot of copyright links, I should say. So all that's there. Also, if you are looking to get help with research for your conference materials or any other journal articles or things like that you're doing, please reach out to the research liaison librarians like Nicole or Jenny, so you can find the contact information for your particular schools there. So /library/help and information/research librarians. And there's also some online support. You can go and look at things like altmetrics and citation counts and all that kind of stuff as well at /library/support for researchers. So please go and check those out. So any questions just before we wrap up today?
Yes, I had a question, sorry.
Yes, Roberta, we'll go ahead.
Yeah, my question was around not so much conferences, but say webinars that you might be doing for professional development. So for a professional association, And also, if we were using, say, a screenshot of a particular website, so we wanted to direct people somewhere to get resources, how would we go around sort of giving attribution to that other than putting the web address?
Sure. So it really depends on the audience. So where things are being used internally, so if this is being done only within the, say, university, or it's only been done within a particular organization, you can usually, for that internal business use, you can show a little bit more material. But if you're just doing an online open presentation, usually you'd need to go and seek permission. So for example, for the library webinars that we do, we reached out to all of our database owners, the big websites like Ostley and all those other things that we did. We checked into Google, we checked into Wikipedia, all of that stuff that we're likely to show. And we either tracked down their permissions, looked at the sites that were open licensed, or directly contacted the owners to get that permission, just to make sure that, you know, when we put the stuff up into YouTube, there weren't going to be any copyright issues. So it just depends, I guess, on how open the audience is going to be for the sessions that you're doing. So if something is going into a YouTube and potentially anybody could be accessing it, it's always best to have a look at the actual site you're going to show. And if you can't get permission, it's better to stick to just a link. People always say, oh, but I'm just making my YouTube video private. Doesn't matter. That's considered public. And that kind of public presentation is actually, again, one of the things that is restricted under all rights reserved copyright to the actual copyright owner itself.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, if you have more details around that, please feel free to send them through to copyright, and we can, you know, look at them a little bit more for you if you'd like.
Yeah, sure, cool, thanks.
Because sometimes too, people want to show stuff and they're like, oh, but it's copyrighted, and then I'll look into it and it turned out it's actually open license and it's perfectly fine to show. But it really depends on what the site is, what they allow for, and you know, how what essentially the audience is going to be and how you're making it available.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thank you.
While we did focus on conferences this time, any kind of, you know, public presentation that's happening with organizations or with symposiums, anything like that, a lot of the same rules basically apply. So it's just being careful to kind of cross your T's and dot your I's, and not showing content. It's one of those things that a lot of people don't really think about. And again, it just depends on, is it an internal audience? Is it a potentially external audience, and how it's being shared? So, so things, for example, going onto YouTube, we always aim to get everything signed off and get those permissions. If it's going into Panopto, which for us is the university's internal video system, we've got more leeway to be able to show material because it's considered internal business use.
Yeah, so that was another question I had. So if we were, say, teaching in the university, we'd be able to like display stuff with a link or attribution.
Yeah. So
to request permission
for teaching, that's actually covered under a different exception in the Act. So we have the Educational Statutory License, which allows us to use a certain amount of material. So for example, you wouldn't be able to click through an entire web page and show every single page, but a website, I should say, and show every single page, but showing the odd bit here and there is usually considered okay. And there are certain things you can't. So if you're, I don't think either of you are working with Australian standards, for example, but those are a bit of a no-no because they're specially licensed and they're quite restrictive. But general websites and things like that are perfectly fine to show in an educational context and be recorded. The only distinction there is stuff like YouTube is problematic. So YouTube, you should never actually record into a session unless it's something like a TED Talk or something that's been open licensed as part of the materials. And again, if you need more information around that, please feel free to reach out. I always like to see what examples people are using, because it's helpful for me to know what's actually being used out in the real spaces in the university, because that then means I can create support materials around it.
What about a GIF in a lecture? GIFs in a lecture?
Are you actually recording it into, or are you just using it in Canvas?
Just in Canvas.
Okay, yeah. funnily enough, I actually have a whole page around GIFs. It's a question I get asked a lot. So if you're getting them from Giphy, which a lot of people do, so that's GIPHY, there are, I guess, legal GIFs and illegal GIFs in there. So if you're getting anything from the blue tick verified sources, so that's stuff like, you know, Archer from FX or RuPaul's Drag Race or those kind of channels within Giphy, those are actually approved coming directly from the copyright owner. If you're getting things that are randomly pulled in from, like, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, it's just IMGUR, I think is the site. Imgur, is that it?
Yeah.
Those ones tend to be just randomly created by people that may not be following copyright. But I can send you the information sheet I have on, you know, how to actually find good GIFs.
Okay.
Okay, just to finish off, we've got our feedback slide here. So again, if you'd like to provide any feedback on the webinar series, please use the link there. So newcastle.libwizard.com/F for form /researcher HDR. And they're anonymous, and we have a look at all of them and go through and do it. Other than that, if there are no other questions, thank you everyone for coming, and we'll send out those links with the recording.